Hey guys, and welcome to another Walk-In Wednesday. Today I have a gun to talk about. It is a 1911 Colt. Now some of you are shocked because I'm actually bringing to you an American weapon. I'm almost always bringing you German weapons, and secondly would be Japanese weapons, and very rarely bring you anything that's U.S. So I'm way overdue to present to you a gun from the United States of America. Now the reason I am is because there's a story behind this gun. I actually have information from the man who carried this gun throughout the war. He was a pilot. We'll get to that. But I rarely get any guns with any kind of attribution, meaning whenever I sell a gun, German, Japanese, or American, people say, what's the story behind the gun? And typically the story is, I found it at a gun show or I won it at an auction. There is no story. I'd say more than 90% of the guns we sell, there is no story. You would think with the American weapons, the families would have more stories to tell about, Grandpa carried this in the war, but we rarely get any attribution of a gun to a person, to a serviceman. In this case, this gun was carried by Paul Tidwell. Now, he eventually started out as a private, of course, but eventually became a captain and a pilot. So this video is a little bit like a video I did previously, and actually one of our most popular videos. If you look at this link, Kenneth Price was a car dealer in Kansas, but he also was a war hero, and you should check out that video if you haven't done that yet. And I also have, over in this corner of my room, I have another GI who was a combat engineer who was at D-Day, and I'm going to be doing that video next. So I have a couple videos here telling the story of a gun and the person who carried this gun. So most of the story comes from his son, and my understanding is he's his only son who has no surviving children, and therefore they decided to sell this. In the words of the son, we wanted a collector who would honor the memory of our father to get this because I have no heir to pass it on to. Many people write to me and say, why would anybody sell these heirlooms? In this case, he wants to make sure the memory is preserved. So Paul Tidwell was born in 1920 in Blountsville, Alabama. The best I can tell is he enlisted into the Army in 1942. He could have been drafted, called up, but he certainly entered the Army in about 1942, and he went to basic training at Camp Croft, South Carolina. I have several artifacts of his life that I want to bring up to you. The only one I found from Camp Croft was a New Testament. Check this out. Interestingly, whenever I get an assemblage of like a Foot Locker from the GIs and different artifacts from the families, it often includes a New Testament. So that means that these were issued. In fact, inside, it's Paul Tidwell writes his name, he has his battalion, and it says Camp Croft, South Carolina, U.S. Army. So he went into the U.S. Army and he ended up in the Air Corps. But what I found interesting, so today, separation of church and state, there's no way that they would allow the Army to hand out Bibles to people. And I wonder if they had a Old Testament version for Jewish people. I'm sure they weren't giving out any Korans. But I find it interesting that Franklin Delano Roosevelt actually signed this Bible. And basically, Roosevelt says this can be a source of wisdom, counsel, and inspiration, foundation for strength, now and always. So they were giving out a Bible. Now, one thing I'll say about Paul, he either was very serious about his faith and kept this in pristine condition, or he never read it because this thing, the binding is barely cracked. So 1942 till today, it's in like new condition. So those of you who have been in the Army basic training, you know you take a lot of tests. And part of those tests is they want to find out how smart you are. And they do cull the herd a bit, meaning the people who excel in leadership or brains, they will put them into special units, special training. And certainly Paul Tidwell must have scored very high because he went right into special training for officer training school and flight training school. So after basic training, he was first assigned to paratrooper school in Fort Benning, Georgia. And that's where he was exposed to actually more training and the planes. He must have shown promise and interest in planes because then he went to additional training. And from what I can tell, he was in training for well over a year. He went to flight school and learned how to be a pilot. And I have a couple of things that I want to show you from that training. So his flight training school was actually in Malden, Missouri. And this is the Army Air Corps. The Air Force was not a separate division. Most of you know that. It wasn't like now we have a separate division just for the Air Force. But in World War II, it was the U.S. Army Air Corps. So it was a division of the U.S. Army. So even though he went into the Army, and then he went to paratrooper training and then ended up in the Air Corps, it's all part of the Army. And this book in particular was his graduation, just like we got, when I was in high school, I got a graduation book. This was his graduation book, his class. Early 1944 is what I can determine. And there's a couple of interesting things that I want to show you about training back then in Missouri. And also, he seemed to spend some time in Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. As I page through, the first thing I wanted to do is show you that he is in here for the class of 44. Class of 44A, so early 1944, there's Paul Tidwell with a big smile on his face. But I want to show you a couple other things. They did participate in a lot of athletic events. You can see in the beginning of the book that they had, a lot, it looks like they had a swim club. They actually had a track team. And here is a picture of him. This was actually from his family. Here you can see Paul, who's the last one on the left. He had his buddies sign the back. And by the way, he did the 2-mile relay, and he set a record for the base, 7 minutes and 47 seconds. I think that's pretty good, but that was their relay team in June of 1943. So he's still in training to become a pilot, and he's participating in the 2-mile relay team. So as we page through the book, you see all the different classes from 1944 and the different squadrons. And again, this is a flight training school. They have all the soldiers. And as you get to the back of the book, you see a squadron of African-American soldiers. So in Missouri and Alabama, Tuskegee Air Force Base, we know that they trained black soldiers to be pilots and to work as part of the crews. And they are segregated, just part of our history. And they have a section, there's actually several pages of African-American soldiers who were in the U.S. Army Air Corps. So just a little bit of history that I thought you would find interesting, found in this book, which goes with the assembly. Now, I should say right now, this has already been sold to somebody, and we have to send it out today. And that's why I wanted to bring you this video today before it left the door. So before we move on to the war, I just wanted to show you a couple other books these are, again, just like his Bible, these books are all in pristine condition. So he must have been quite fastidious. Later he turned out to be a CPA, and that just kind of fits. This one in particular, he has a book on the computers. And so I thought, oh my gosh, this must have been the early precursor to the computer. So I opened it up to see his computer, and there it is. This is his computer. I think we would call that like a slide rule or something. But that was his computer that he was trained on for flight school. And actually, I think there's one here. So here it is. Now he's a lieutenant. So Lieutenant Tidwell is on the back, and this would be his trusty computer. It does come in a laptop model. It fits. Look at that, it fits on my lap. So this is his laptop computer, way ahead of his time. And it says right there, U.S. Army Air Force. Talk about fastidious, he's got his name here, he's got his name here, he's got his name on his Bible, and we'll see that throughout all of these, he puts his name on everything. Tidwell bits. So back to his training, as I said, he graduated in 44, and then he was transported to England. He was stationed in England, and he arrived there right after D-Day. So he missed the D-Day invasion, but he got involved very quickly in, again, training there. He was flying the C-47, which is a transport plane. And a couple of his missions, he carried paratroopers. Remember, he trained to be a paratrooper, and then he ended up being a pilot. And if I had my druthers, I would rather stay in the plane and not jump out of the plane. But this is a couple of his patches. You can see he was a troop carrier. He carried carried the paratroopers, but also gliders. And I watched a little bit of video about how they would pick up the gliders and found it fascinating. It took a lot of precision flying, a lot of training where they would catch the rope, pull the glider. You wonder what's the advantage between the glider and the paratrooper. And if you can see in this video that they actually got a lot of men and equipment and jeeps and artillery and things like that into a glider. And they were used at D-Day. Gliders were used at D-Day. Of course, he missed that. But the next time they used gliders and paratroopers was in Operation Market Garden. His family does believe he was involved in Operation Market Garden, although I don't have any records of that. But those of you who know the Operation Market Garden, it was quite famous and somewhat infamous in that it was it was successful, but also it had some disastrous results. It was A Bridge Too Far. If you've seen the movie A Bridge Too Far, there was a plan to try to capture bridges. They wanted to catapult themselves through the Netherlands into Germany. And in order to do that, they tried to capture 3 bridges. The first 2 were taken by American paratroopers, but the last and the most dangerous job of all was left to the British paratroopers. They went to the 3rd bridge, and basically the whole unit was either wiped out or captured. So it was disastrous for the British paratroopers, but it was successful in that they captured 2 bridges and got through the Netherlands a lot quicker than expected. And Paul Tidwell was probably involved in that operation, which used both gliders and paratroopers. So the next major campaign for Paul Tidwell, and if you know your military history, after Operation Market Garden, the Allies were really doing well and really felt like they had Germany on the run. And then came December of 1944, and of course, the Battle of the Bulge. And that has been the subject of many movies and documentaries most of you've heard of and seen movies about the Battle of the Bulge. But basically, that's where the Germans launched a major campaign in the middle of the winter, which nobody expected, took all of the Allied soldiers by surprise and really routed the frontline troops. And it was right around Christmas time. It actually began in December 16th. And to make things even worse, one of the biggest problems was the U.S. Army Air Corps and the British Air Force had control of the skies. But unfortunately, there was really bad weather during that time, and certainly played to the German side, that we were not able to get to the troops, reinforce the troops, or give them supplies. So what ended up happening, for about 10 days, there were no flights, and the frontline soldiers were running out of food, ammunition, and it was looking really, really bleak. Until the skies began to lift, and fortunately, men like Paul Tidwell were then able to fly in on their C-47 transport planes, dropping reinforcements, paratroopers, and dropping supplies, including gliders full of equipment, men, ammunition, food, the whole 9 yards. So it really turned the corner on the battle, and of course, most of you know the 101st Airborne was trapped in Bastogne, and they were finally relieved by Patton's army. So there's a lot of history all coming together in December of 1944 and into January of 1945 before we really turned the tide of the war again back into Germany. And then finally, he was involved in the crossing of the Rhine River into Germany, and they did send in paratroopers to capture bridges that went across the Rhine. So Paul Tidwell was involved throughout major campaigns after D-Day all the way to the end of the war. And particularly, speaking of the end of the war, in April of 45, he was involved in flying in supplies, which was mostly ammunition, food, and fuel. And on the flight out, he was bringing out wounded soldiers for medical treatment, but also they related that he brought out concentration camp victims. He must have been bringing people back from the concentration camp to the Allied side for medical treatment, which he was particularly proud of and talked about with his family. The one story that he tells about that period of time is he was, as he's bringing in supplies, and it had a very short runway. It wasn't really built for a lot of transport planes. And he said the short runway, they filled his plane with wounded and concentration camp victims. And they said he was overloaded, but he wanted to get more people out. And so he insisted that they just pile the people in there to get them help. And that was probably, he said it was one of his most dangerous missions. And when he got to the end of the runway, there was a fence. And he went all the way down the runway, about to crash into the fence. He was able to bounce the plane over the fence and then bounced on the other side and out and took off safely. They mentioned that in Battle of the Bulge and several of the battles, he came back and his plane was riddled with bullets. So he saw a lot of action. He served his country well, and he made it safely through the war. Finally, at the end of the war, his family related that the story that he told how the war ended in May, he began to transport important U.S. Army personnel back to the United States for training to invade Japan. He said the route took him to Bermuda and from Bermuda to Miami. And it was during one of those flights from Bermuda to Miami that he heard over the radio that the United States had just dropped a super bomb and that the war was over. So at that point, his military career was done. So post-war, Paul Tidwell, I already said he was a fastidious young man and intelligent, and he became a CPA, went back to school, became a CPA, and he actually worked for NASA in the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, where his family said he worked on the Saturn rocket program and eventually the space shuttle. Paul also married in 1948, so soon after he came back from the war, and he passed away in January of 2008. So in conclusion of his life, I have a couple of personal effects I wanted to show you because they're very, very cool. And I want to honor the memory of this man who served his country well, including during the war and after. But we have his original dog tag, and it's hard to imagine giving this up, but we have an original dog tag. I'd like to believe that the family still has another because I know my dad had several from World War II. So and also we have this, which is, I open it up, it's a sewing kit. So it's his personal effects, an Army Air Corps sewing kit. And of course, it comes in various colors, including tan and olive green. So everything they wore was either tan or olive green. So very fitting. I'm sure this was issued to him by the U.S. Army Air Corps. And then finally, we have his glasses. So you see on the top, this was issued by the Army Air Corps. Very cool. World War II, aviator glasses. Got to check this out, but these were Paul's, and it's my honor to be able to put these on. How about it? Do I look like an aviator? Thank you, Paul, and thank you to his family for sharing all of this with us, and thank you to the vets who served their country well. Let me read you just one last thing that his son wrote at the very end of his note. He said, "You may ask me why I'm selling these things. I'm an only child. My wife and I do not have any children, and we want to pass them on to somebody who will really appreciate them. We're downsizing and simplifying our lives. My father has been dead for 11 years now, and these things do not define who he is. I'm keeping copies of the photographs and the pocket New Testament that was given to him by Chaplain Madison at Camp Croft. In the back, he signed a covenant with God on February 2nd, 1945. It is my conviction that my father is alive in Christ, and I will see him again." But let's take a look at the gun, because I know you guys just love to learn more about the gun itself. So the gun, of course, came with a shoulder holster, which they say tankers and aviators commonly use the shoulder holster. I'm not going to put my shoulder through it because I want to take it off and show it to you. Again, pristine condition. I think some of you learned a new word today, particularly our foreign visitors. Fastidious is not a word that a lot of people use, but I've used it at least 4 or 5 times. This thing is in pristine condition. He just took really good care of all of his equipment. The gun itself is a beautiful gun. And what's important to note about it is that it is a U.S. Army Colt. And people often ask, how do you know that something went to the Air Corps? Or how do you know it went to the Navy? And the truth is, it's really hard to know for sure. Now, Navy, they do have serial numbers. And if you go to the internet, we use this all the time. They do have a website Here's the website here. You can look up production numbers and where they went, but it's not always correct, meaning this went to the U.S. Army, but it was given to Paul Tidwell, who went into the Air Corps, and I can only imagine it went with him. This was issued to him probably after he was an officer, because this was made in 43, and he, of course, became an officer, a lieutenant by 43, and he was a captain by the time he was, by 1944, he became a captain, and this is probably the gun that he carried while he was flying all of his missions. The gun most associated with the U.S. Army Air Corps is the Union Switch and Signal. It's commonly believed that most of those went to the Air Corps, and most of the research I read on those, and also singers, some of the singers went to the Air Corps. Quality, they only made 500 singers, and I did a video. You can check that out. I show you 2.5 singers. Very expensive, but they only made 500 singers. And of the Union Switch and Signals, they made about 55,000 of them. Here's a Union Switch and Signal that we have in stock. 55,000 compared to about 1 million of the World War II Colts. And of course, Remington and Ithaca were also makers of the 1911 Colt. So those were all the major makers. Union Switch and Signal, most of these went to the U.S. Army Air Corps. And here are some of the differences. I can't really see a difference in the bluing, but people who do this a lot tell me right away, oh, this is obviously Dew-Lite. This is a Dew-Lite finish, and this is a Parkerized finish. To me, they look very similar. I do honestly see a slight difference. There's a few other differences. We'll take a close-up look at these. The Colt will have a cross-cannon cartouche, and you can see that on the right side toward the back. You can see that cartouche. Sometimes they're very light and barely visible, and they're almost always offset in the way they're struck, meaning one side is heavy and the other side is lighter. I really never see them perfectly stamped, but you will see the cartouche on the Colts. They are not present on the U.S. Switch and Signal. You can look on the back, there is none. All of the variations fall into a specific serial range, and that's available on that website. They're usually more expensive than the Colt because of the production numbers, so you just want to make sure it falls in the right range. There's also a few other subtle differences, such as if you look at the grips, you'll see around the grip screw there is no reinforcers, as opposed to, and that's just like a ring around the screw, ring around the rosy. You can see on the Colt that there's a little ring. Those are the correct grips. If I take this down, the Colt will have a barrel that is marked Colt Auto 45. That would be the correct barrel for the Colt. Whereas the Union Switch and Signal typically will have an HS barrel or high standard barrel. The back, which is the mainspring housing, a very slight difference. If you look at the two of them, the Union Switch and Signal has a slightly finer checkering than the Colt. And so that's something you want to watch out for. So the finish, the grips, the back of the gun, and there's a few other little things that I look for on a Union Switch and Signal to make sure that it's all correct. Both of these guns, by the way, come with a magazine that is marked S. Very hard to see, but it's right on the lip. S stood for Scoville, which is the maker, but there's also R marked, which is Risden. So L, Littleton. So there's different makers, and you will see that right on the lip. And really, any of those makers would be appropriate for these guns because they were made by other factories and just issued to all of the 1911 Colts. Both of these guns, of course, come in a .45 caliber, which has great stopping power. One other thing you want to watch out for on all of the Colts is after the war they were reworked. If they went back to an arsenal, they will be marked. There's usually a stamp. It'll say SA for Springfield Armory or RIA, Rock Island. There's also Ogden. I believe it's OG. So if there's any, there's an Anniston AA, Anniston Arsenal. If there's any markings on the frame of the gun, meaning it was reworked, they usually swapped out some of the parts and reparkerized the gun or refinished the gun in some way, not necessarily parkerized. If that happens, it hurts the value. It can cut the value as much as in half because it's not original. So when you go to our site or to Gunbroker or a place like that, and you see a 1911 that has a price of $1,500, and you think, wow, that's really cheap. When the all original World War II one is going to be more like 3,000 or even more. There are rare variations, of course, like a Union Switch can go for 5,000 to 7,000. Rarer variations will go for more money, but just a standard 1911, if it's been reworked, you're talking about 1,200 to 1,500. If it's all original condition, which is hard to find, they can be double that. Since this one came directly from the family, it was never reworked. I don't know why some people, I guess officers, were allowed to keep their weapon. Most people had to turn them in and then they were reworked. In this case, it came directly from the family and was never reworked. Another difference that is real obvious as you're looking at the gun, and actually it's really faint. On the left side of the frame, you will see it's always very faint. I can barely see them, and by the way, when they're refinished, they're even more faint. But it is RCD marked, which is the inspector proof, stood for Robert Downing. Later became a movie star. No, that's Robert Downey Jr. I don't know if it's any relation, but Robert Downing, a brigadier general, was responsible for the inspection, and it would be stamped on the left side of the frame. And on the Colts, this one from 1943, both of these guns are from 1943, by the way. There is no circle, it just says GHD, which is Guy Drury, Guy H. Drury as the inspector, and again, he was a brigadier general. So that's the story of this gun and the life of Paul Tidwell. Again, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and kudos to Paul Tidwell and his family for their service to our country. Make sure you like and subscribe, and tell a friend about our channel. We're getting more and more subscribers every day. We're about to hit 20,000 subscribers, so keep up the good work. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so that you're notified when I come out with the next video, which is going to be another story about a US GI who was an Army engineer and brought back a Luftwaffe pistol. So you're going to want to check that out.